It was an unusually warm autumn evening when I moved into my new house. I'd been searching for months, wanting a fresh start after a particularly difficult breakup. The house was quaint, located on the outskirts of town, with overgrown ivy creeping up the sides, and the trees surrounding it cast long shadows on the yard. Despite its eerie appearance, the price was right, and I figured the quietness would be perfect for the peace I craved. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time unpacking, settling into the house, and adjusting to the quiet rhythm of life in the countryside. The only issue I encountered was the neighbours. They were distant, almost too distant. The house to the left of mine was always dark, with no sign of life. I never saw anyone coming or going. The house on the right was a different story. The windows were always open and the curtains never fully closed. The people there, a middle-aged couple named Sarah and Michael, rarely spoke to me, but it didn't bother me much. I was here to be alone, to find my peace again. It was on the fifth night that things started to take a strange turn. I had just finished dinner and was sitting in my living room when I heard a faint knock at the door. It was soft, almost hesitant. I got up to answer, not expecting anyone. Standing on the porch was an older woman, probably in her late 60s. She was wearing a heavy woolen coat, and her face was pale, almost ghostly. "Margaret." "Hello, dear. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I live just down the road, and I thought I should introduce myself. My name is Margaret." Her voice sent a shiver down my spine, but I smiled politely. "No, not at all. I'm just getting settled in." "It's nice to meet you, Margaret." She glanced behind her as if making sure no one was watching. "Margaret, it's been a while since anyone's lived here." "A long while indeed." "Yeah, I noticed. It's a lovely place, though." Margaret smiled, but there was something off about it. It wasn't warm or genuine. It was more like a smile someone would give a stranger out of obligation. "Margaret, I see. Well, I just wanted to say welcome and be careful of the woods behind your house." "The woods?" "Margaret, yes, they're not what they seem. There's something in those woods, something you shouldn't be around after dark. Thanks for the warning, but I'm sure it's just trees and animals. I'll be fine." She gave me a long look, as though studying me. "Margaret, well, if you change your mind, don't say I didn't warn you." I watched her walk down the driveway, then disappear into the darkness. The whole encounter left me feeling uneasy, but I quickly shrugged it off as harmless small talk. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Margaret's words, something in the woods. I had no idea what she meant, but my curiosity started to get the better of me. I decided that the next day I'd go for a walk and see the woods for myself. The following afternoon I set out on my walk. The air was crisp and the ground was covered in fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. I walked for a while, the trees growing denser and darker the further I went. After a few minutes I came across an old stone wall covered in moss and ivy. It seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in the woods at all. As I peered over the wall I saw an old decaying building in the distance. It was barely visible through the thick trees, but it looked like a small cabin or shack. I felt a sudden chill run down my spine, and for the first time I realized how quiet it was. Not a single bird was singing, not even the sound of rustling leaves in the wind. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I took a few hesitant steps forward, but before I could get any closer I heard footsteps behind me. I froze. When I turned around there was no one there. I shrugged it off. telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I decided to head back home, but when I turned around, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing by the stone wall, hidden among the trees. The person was wearing a heavy coat, just like the one Margaret had been wearing. I froze again. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I quickly turned and walked back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back until I was safely inside my house, locking the door behind me. The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, and every time I went near the woods, I felt that same sense of unease. Then, one evening, after I returned home from work, I noticed something strange. There was a light on in the house next door, the one that had always been dark. I hadn't seen anyone there since I moved in, and I couldn't recall ever hearing any sounds from that house. But now there was a faint light flickering behind the curtains. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and after a few moments, the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Sarah, the woman from next door. Her face was pale, and she looked as though she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her hair was wild. She stared at me for a moment before speaking. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I didn't expect anyone to come by. I asked her if she was okay, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over her shoulder as though she were listening for something. Sarah, there's something wrong in this place. Something I can't explain." I asked what she meant, but she didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside and motioned for me to come inside. Reluctantly, I did. The inside of the house was just as unsettling as the outside. The walls were lined with old, dusty portraits, and the air smelled musty. Sarah led me to the living room, where her husband, Michael, was sitting in a rocking chair, staring blankly at the wall. He didn't even acknowledge my presence when I walked in. "Sarah, Michael?" Sarah called gently, but he didn't respond. "Sarah, Michael, please. Tell him." He slowly turned his head to look at me, and I felt a cold shiver run through me. His eyes were wide and unblinking, as though he had seen something that had broken him. "Michael, the woods. Don't go into the woods. No one who's gone in has ever come out." The words hung in the air, thick with dread. I didn't know what to say. Before I could respond, Sarah pulled me by the arm and whispered, "Sarah, you have to leave. Now! It's not safe here." I quickly left their house, heart racing. What had I gotten myself into? The next day I decided to leave the town. The house, the woods, everything had become too much. But as I was packing my things, I received a knock at the door. It was Margaret. "Margaret, I warned you. But you didn't listen. No one ever listens." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, disappearing into the trees as if she had never been there. I never returned to that house. I couldn't, but to this day I hear whispers in the wind whenever I pass by that town. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I can hear footsteps behind me in the dark.